Chapter 18. The Crime of the Century in East Tennessee. With the delays in the Carter County justice system, and with Harmon's local connections, it now appeared to the Tollets that Harmon was unlikely to ever be punished for what they perceived to be his cold-blooded murder of their brother and son Arnold Tollett. Bledsoe Countyans in that era tended to have a strict code of justice and resented the slightest interference from outsiders. They held it their right to settle arguments with bullets. Relatives of a man shot down felt it was not only their right, but their duty to seek revenge. The Tollets decided to take the matter into their own hands and hand out some Bledsoe County-style justice. Their first plan was to place a large amount of dynamite under Harmon Gouge's car with the fuse tied to the muffler. When the muffler became hot enough, it would light the fuse and blow up the car. They successfully tested the scheme with an old car at the Bledsoe County Rock Crusher on the road to Dayton, just east of Pikeville. Johnny Vaughn, the Chevrolet dealer in Pikeville, gave them an old car to blow up. In later testimony, Lee Walker stated on Tuesday evening, November the 9th, 1937, that he and White Miller drove down from Pikeville to the home of White Miller's brother-in-law, John Ebbett, in Bledsoe County. Church Lester drove his car off the mountain and met them there. White Miller, Church, and Lee traveled the 225 miles to Hampton, with Lee doing most of the driving. About midnight, Lee let White Miller and Church out of the car 1 block from the Gouge home. They told him to drive a mile or two down the road and come back in 45 minutes. White Miller and Church made certain no one was stirring on the street before slipping quietly through the shadows to the garage in the rear of the Gouge bungalow, where Harmon's 1937 Chevrolet was stored. The garage door was not locked. Church slid under the sedan, and White Miller handed him 3 sticks of dynamite attached to a fuse. Church and White Miller knew exactly how to proceed quickly because they had experimented and practiced their movement until they knew every move to make down to the last detail. Church wired the dynamite to the frame directly under the driver's seat and carefully fastened the other end of the fuse to the exhaust pipe. Then White Miller handed Church 2 more sticks of dynamite, which he wired under the floorboards. They calculated the extra sticks would be set off when the other 3 sticks exploded. White Miller stood guard at the garage door while Church wired the explosives to the car. When Lee drove back to the designated site, the 2 men were not there, so he drove to Bramer and back. This time when he returned, White Miller and Church had walked back to the corner and were waiting for him. The 3 drove back to Pikeville to Bledsoe County, arriving at the Ebbett home around daylight. The next day, Harmon drove his car only on short trips, which didn't heat the muffler hot enough to light the fuse. On the second day, Thursday, Gouge and his employee, Fred Main, took a longer trip. They drove onto the Dayton Hill filling station at Whitehead Hill, where the 2 exited the car. Harmon had stopped to buy a half pint of whiskey and a cola as a chaser, and then went into the bathroom to take a drink. He heard a loud explosion. He and the others rushed outside to find his car had been dynamited. Smoke was bellowing from the car windows, and part of the motor and gears were hurled through the roof of the car. The blast was heard for miles away. Luckily, no one was hurt. Harmon later told Carl Brown that drink of whiskey saved his life. When asked at a later trial the purpose of the trip to place dynamite under the car, Lee Walker replied, "To kill Harmon Gouge." On Friday, May Tollett called Craven Pikeville and told him that their brother-in-law, Frank Thompson, had been arrested and put in jail to be questioned about the explosion. She asked that Crave and Sheriff Walling make the trip to Bramer to see if they could help get Frank released from jail. Harmon Gouge was well aware the Tollets were behind the attempt to kill him. He also knew they were likely to try again. Shortly after his car was dynamited, Harmon purchased a lunchroom in Johnson City and was staying at the Ramona Hotel. He was afraid for his own life and afraid his presence at home would endanger his wife and children. He visited his family and played with his young daughters only during daylight hours, and when others were standing guard outside the house. The absence of her husband was difficult for Harmon's young wife, Pauline. In addition, she was constantly worried that at any time the Tollets would strike again and kill her husband. The worry continued as the weeks slowly passed all the way through Christmas and New Year's Day. Some days Pauline was nearly overcome with depression and wept for hours. Unfortunately, the Tollets were not aware of Harmon's absence from the home. For several days, Crave, White Miller, and Church, with the help from others, planned their revenge at a clandestine meeting in the Tollet restaurant and other locations in Pikeville. The older Tollet brother, Crave, was reported to have been the leader and the mastermind of the planning process. Crave, White Miller, Church, and Sheriff Walling. T.Y. Swafford, Alvin Ulysses Walling, and Lee Walker were good friends who often drank whiskey at the restaurant. Most of them discussed several options before setting on a plan to dynamite the Gouge House. This home had a basement with easy access from the outside. It is believed that the Bledsoe County Sheriff Walter Walling was involved in it or at least aware of the planning. Also, former three-time Sheriff of Bledsoe County, T.Y. Swafford, was in the room when final plans were being made. The families of T.Y. Swafford and Major Tollet were very close friends. Major's son, Arnold, was a deputy when T.Y. was sheriff from 1928 to 1930. Lee Walker, who lived at 9 Mile, was a young man who bootlegged for the Tollets. Lee delivered whiskey to customers and often stood on the street corner to sell. Lee was not afraid to kill either. On March the 29th, 1931, 7 years prior to the Elizabethton killing, the 20-year-old Lee shot and killed Jim Blaylock at Jim Walker's home in 9 Mile. Lee and Jim Blaylock were dating the same girl, and an altercation arose between the two young men. Jim allegedly had a knife and was advancing toward Lee when Lee shot him. Lee was tried for the killing and acquitted. White Miller Tollet or one of the other brothers testified on Lee's behalf at his trial. Ulysses Walling was a relative of Sheriff Walter Walling. His mother, Sarah Walling, ran a restaurant where she also bootlegged on Cumberland Avenue across the street from what is now Bledsoe Telephone Co-op. Ulysses and his mother were good friends of the Tollets. It was reported that one of the planning sessions for the trip to Elizabethton to kill Harmon Gouge was conducted at Sarah's home the night before. At this meeting, Sarah was said to have volunteered her 23-year-old son Ulysses to make the trip with them. 2 years prior to this, the young Ulysses had shot and critically wounded Albert Winthrow, a civilian Conservation Corps boy, in his mother's restaurant January the 18th, 1936. Withrow was said to be drinking and unruly. Both Ulysses and Lee Walker were deputy sheriffs for Walling. On Thursday, January the 6th, 1938, White Miller and Ulysses made a trip to Chattanooga during the afternoon and bought 2 dynamite fuses. That same day, Carl Brown, Lee Walker, Dallas Talley, and Bill Walker made a trip to Walden's Ridge above Pitt's Gap to load 2 trucks with sawed lumber for Lee Naramore. On the way back to Pikeville with the lumber, the 4 of them stopped at Daddy Cagle's Red Barn, located about 5 miles south of Pikeville, where Lee Walker bought some whiskey. They let Dallas off at his house on the south side of Pikeville. Carl, Lee, and Bill arrived at the Tollet restaurant around dark, around 6 o'clock. Carl and Bill had to wait an hour or 2 in the restaurant for someone to give them a ride to their homes in 9 Mile. Crave, White Miller, T.Y. Swafford, Sheriff Walter Walling, Ulysses Walling, Lee Walker, and others were in Tollet's restaurant on the night of January the 6th, 1938, before 3 of them left for Elizabethton. They were drinking, and all except maybe Lee knew most of the details of the plan. Church wasn't with them that night, but had helped with the planning and agreed to join the other 3 in the head of the valley on the way to Elizabethton. The Tollets asked T.Y. Swafford if he wanted to go with them, to which he replied, "Boys, if it were Bledsoe County, I'd go with you and help take care of him." In other words, T.Y. knew the chances of getting away with killing someone in Bledsoe County would have been good. However, he was wise enough to steer clear of getting involved with killing someone in a county far from home. About 8 o'clock that evening, Ulysses Walling, White Miller Tollett, Lee Walker, Bill Walker, and Carl Brown left Pikeville in Ulysses' 1937 Chevrolet car. White Miller took along 2 pints of whiskey. Ulysses was driving and White Miller was in the front seat. Carl, Lee, and Bill were in the back seat. White Miller kept the others entertained with a 6-inch turkey's foot by playing with it by shaking the claws in an amusing way. The dynamite was evidently in the trunk, because Carl didn't even see any inside the car. They let Carl and Bill, who were not aware of the Tollett's plan to dynamite the Gouge home, out at their homes in 9 Mile. And when they let Carl off, they told him they would be picking him up the next morning. Ulysses proceeded to drive on up the valley with passengers White Miller and Lee to the home of John and Betty Evatt, where they stopped to pick up Church Lester. Betty was Crave and White Miller's sister, and she and her husband lived near her parents' home. Ulysses Walling, White Miller Tollett, Lee Walker, and Church Lester continued on their now infamous trip to Hampton. Ulysses and Lee took turns driving, while White Miller and Church sat in the back seat. Both Lee and Ulysses later testified they were drinking heavily that evening. The 4 arrived a block away from the Harmon Gouge home on 1st Street, near the center of the small town of Hampton, about 2:45 a.m. on a rainy Friday morning. They told Lee to let them out, drive off, and come back in 15 minutes. Ulysses stood guard at the intersection of while Church and White Miller carried bundles of dynamite and fuses up the street to a vent window in the foundation of the Gouge home. They moved quickly as they crawled through the vent window and placed nearly a case of dynamite under the bedroom where they thought Harmon would be sleeping. They used 2 long fuses in case one went out before it reached the dynamite. They attached each one of the carefully spliced waterproof fuses to the dynamite and carefully unrolled the 2 long coils of fuse back toward the road. Church went back under the house to make sure both fuses were securely attached to the dynamite. When he got back to the road, he whispered to White Miller, "Okay, let her go." White Miller quickly lit a match to the ends of both fuses. Each caught, and thus started a grim race between 2 tiny sparking fuses as to which would get to the destination first. The fuses burned at the rate of about a foot a minute. In the meantime, Lee had driven the getaway car to Bill Nave's filling station and beer joint and parked for a few minutes. When he returned in 15 minutes, the 3 others were not at their prearranged meeting place. Lee drove off for a few more minutes, and the next time he returned, the 3 were waiting. They climbed in the car and sped off toward Pikeville. Ulysses Walling was reported to have said, "Somebody's going to get blown to hell." The fuses were lit between 2:30 and 2:45 a.m. A little over an hour later, at 3:50, an enormous blast awakened everyone in Hampton. It all happened in a few short seconds. At first there was a flash, and then a roaring shock wave echoed through the town and sent tremors through nearby Cedar Mountain. The explosion left the cozy 6-room Gouge bungalow in shambles. The home was reduced to a heap of broken timber and plaster, with pieces of furniture and appliances flung everywhere. The 2 beds in which the mother and her 3 little girls were tucked away and sleeping were blown from under them. Pauline Gouge and her daughters were trapped under the broken and splintered rafters and timbers. The walls of the cellar had caved in. The blast broke windows and knocked plaster from the walls of many homes nearby. The blast threw Fletcher Gouge, Harmon's brother, from his bed in his home next door. Fletcher quickly jumped into his trousers and shoes and ran next door, where he discovered a gruesome scene. He pulled Pauline, who was unconscious, from under the timber, carried her to his house, and wrapped her in a blanket. By that time, half-clad neighbors had rushed to the scene. They commenced digging frantically within the debris of the walls. Of a child was heard. They soon recovered the bodies of the 3 little girls from beneath twisted rafters and studs. Sonia, 9, and Roma Jean, 6, were dead. Lurene 8 was still breathing but died within minutes. Instead of dealing death to Harmon Gouge as the bombers intended, the victims were his 3 innocent children. Fletcher Gouge carried his sister-in-law, who was still unconscious, out to his car to drive her to the hospital, but he suddenly realized that his car might also be booby-trapped with dynamite. So Pauline was taken to the hospital in a neighbor's car. She was in critical condition, suffered from multiple bruises, shock, and her chest was crushed, resulting in several broken ribs. She was rushed into the operating room and placed on the shock table. She didn't regain consciousness at that time, but as her respirations became normal, she was moved to a hospital bed. Harmon was asleep in his bed at the Ramona Hotel in Johnson City when the terrible ordeal occurred. As soon as he was notified, he went straight to the hospital, where he stayed by Pauline's side and held her hand. She was in such a serious state of shock she could not be told of the deaths of her daughters until after their funerals. Edith and Rob Nave, were a young newlywed couple who were neighbors of Harmon and Pauline Gouge. Only a vacant lot on First Street separated the two homes. Edith was well acquainted with Pauline and her 3 small daughters. She described Pauline as an excellent neighbor and a lovely person who was very good to her, and the Gouge girls as fun-loving, sweet little blonde girls. When Edith and Rob were rudely awakened by the huge blast, they were naturally traumatized and shocked. The blast jarred loose a cord on a lamp inside their home and hurled a timber through their screened-in back porch, but didn't cause extensive damage to their 2-bedroom home. After the blast, Rob Nave helped rescue the 3 Gouge girls from the wreckage and took them to the hospital in his car. The days following the blast were very difficult for 20-year-old Edith, 7 months pregnant with their couple's first child. She and her neighbors feared Harmon Gouge's enemies might return to strike again. Since Edith was pregnant and afraid to stay in the home alone while Rob was working, they talked a young lady into staying with her. Edith said they all 3 sometimes even slept in the same bed because neither of the women wanted to be alone. Shortly after their daughter was born in March, Edith and Rob moved out of their home on First Street to a new home where they wouldn't have to worry about their safety. The funeral for the 3 little Gouge girls was scheduled for the 2 o'clock Sunday at the First Baptist Church in Elizabethton. Over 6,000 mourners tried to attend. In addition, the state police estimated 12,000 curious people from all around the area drove through Hampton on Sunday to see the remains of the Gouge home. There was a huge traffic jam with double lines of very slow-moving automobiles on the road between Hampton and Elizabethton. The funeral service had to be delayed for several hours. Most people had to stand outside the church and watch as the 3 little white caskets were carried into the church. By the time the service concluded, darkness was descending, causing them to wait until the next day to transport the bodies to the cemetery. The 3 girls were laid to rest Monday morning in a tiny Gouge family cemetery on a high hill overlooking the road between Hampton and Roan Mountains. The Hampton grade school children were taken out of class and marched to a big tent at the bottom of a mountain near the gravesite. They placed each casket on a sled, and with 2 white horses pulling the caskets up the steep hill to the cemetery.